Hi everybody, my name's Zach, and today I'm going to be talking to you about building sticky user experiences. From my experience at Facebook, LinkedIn, and OneSignal, I've had the opportunity to actually look at what works for notifications, emails, and other ways of reaching your users across more than 4 trillion messages. And so there's a lot of data insights I'm going to share. We'll go through a couple things. How we define stickiness and different ways to think about what that means even outside of the digital world. How we measure stickiness and different metrics and ways to kind of capture that. Third, we'll talk about some of the interesting insights backed up by data from experiments in how to drive more stickiness and engagement from your users. And fourth, we'll talk about different things you can do to create stickiness. Interventions, ways you can think about targeting messages, and so on. My plan is to take about 40 minutes to go through this and leave about 10 minutes at the end for any questions you may have. You can ask kind of in the session chat, and we'll go through that stuff at the end. So, what is a sticky experience? Before we actually start thinking through what that means for digital products, I actually like to start with a real world analog. I call this a analog. And the value of doing that is, instead of thinking through the exact nuances of how a product works or technology works, it kind of forces us to think about what this means in the real world. So if you've ever gone running and had a runner's high and felt really, really good after running for 5 or 10 or 20 miles, there's something that is addictive about that. There's something that draws you to want to do that again. Now, not every person who goes for a run feels this way, but for folks who are regular runners who really like running, they maybe sleep better, they feel calmer, they have time to think through what happened in the day. Or if you practice mindfulness and you meditate at the end of a day after you've been in 8 hours of Zoom meetings. These are analog experiences that we have, but actually, in a certain sense, are sticky experiences for folks who do these things regularly. And so we can think about what makes an experience sticky kind of by what it does for us. So switching now to sort of the apps we use, the services we use. Sticky experiences can be sticky because they make us feel good, right? That song you like from Spotify or Amazon Music or Pandora, or the serendipity of discovering a new artist. The fun of looking at cat videos on Instagram or playing a game on Fortnite. They can help us get work done faster. So you could think about the whole sort of productivity suite here: Google Docs, Zoom, Slack, Grammarly, and so on. They help us communicate, right, with a loved one or a colleague. WhatsApp, iMessage, Facebook Messenger, and so on. An experience can be sticky because it helps us learn and satisfies our curiosity. Woodworking videos on YouTube or a new skill on Coursera. And experiences can be sticky because they actually help us get somewhere. They get us from point A to point B, give us a roof over our head in a place that we want to go travel. So we can think about experiences being sticky by kind of what they do for us. And to simplify it even a little bit more, we could think about, does it do something useful for us? Where utility here, maybe we can think of as not just getting work done, but entertainment can be utility, as an example. So let's jump into how we might measure what a sticky experience is. And this will actually resemble very closely when you think about engagement with an app or a website. So a natural question when you're thinking through metrics is kind of the various life stages of building an app. You want to get users to try it. You want to get them engaged. Once you've built a meaningful user base, maybe you think about monetization if that's part of the business. So why are we focusing on this whole stickiness piece and this whole engagement piece? Well, it's the thing that you really want to get right before you put new users in the top of your funnel. And it's the thing that if you don't get right, you can actually spend a lot of money bringing new users into the top of your funnel. You can advertise. You can message all of your users as a one-off to try and pull them to discover a new feature or something like that. But if they don't want to keep coming back, they are probably not going to pay you in the future, right? So you'll have a hard time monetizing them. And you'll end up putting a lot of effort and a lot of time into trying to attract new users instead of maintaining and growing the user base that you have with folks who are enthusiastic about your product, with things like referrals. So that's why we're focusing on stickiness and engagement. Now, what you see here is kind of growth accounting. So we can think about the number of active users in this period as being a function of how many people were users last period who are also users this period, plus the new folks I brought in, maybe downloaded my app or came to the website for the first time, signed up for the first time, plus how many users are resurrected. That is to say, they were not active last period, but they were active sometime further back than that, and came back to my platform in this most recent period. And then I have to subtract off the people who were active last period, but are not active this period. And so this framework actually lets us break apart the number of users active in a period to understand if that's actually good or bad. So what do I mean by that? You could see 50% month-on-month growth in, let's say, monthly active users, as an example. That's not necessarily good or bad. What we need to do is look one level more deeply to say, well, if I had 100 users last month and none of them are coming back, so active users from the previous period was 100, but churned users was also 100. And let's say I bought ads and was able to get 150 new users this period. So all of the users this period are, let's say, new because I brought them in. And although I could see my month-on-month active users growing, I could actually have a really, really, really bad problem with churn. That is, I haven't built an experience that people want to keep coming back to. And so this growth accounting is actually really helpful in teasing out the various pieces of how these kind of high-level metrics on daily active, weekly active, monthly actives are broken apart. So when we're looking at measuring stickiness, we can sort of think about, are we doing this useful thing on a consistent basis? And historically, the thinking is, okay, if I'm doing it regularly for someone, particularly for like a social media app or kind of consumer-focused app, I'll have more usage. I'll see daily actives, weekly actives go up. And that's a good first pass. As we mentioned, we sort of need to be thoughtful about that growth piece. But the underlying thing that I would emphasize is, separate from all the metrics, think about doing something really useful for your users on a consistent basis. If you're not doing something useful on a consistent basis, maybe they come in, they buy something one time, but they never come back and they don't buy again in the future. They play a game that doesn't have enough levels, so they tire out of your game and they don't keep coming back. So you don't get that consistency. Likewise, if they come once and don't have a good experience, it's not useful to them, or fun to them, or interesting, or helps them get their work done better or faster, then you don't have a experience they're going to keep coming back to. So when we think about measurement, there's kind of three elements here. There's frequency, intensity, and we'll talk about retention curves. Frequency is kind of what we talked about. It's a usage metric. How many people are coming to your service? How many daily active, or weekly active, or monthly active? And in terms of figuring out which unit is the right one to look at there, you could look at like your user base. So out of a common, out of a week, how many times in that week are your users coming? Are they coming 3 times a week, 1 time a week? And you can get a distribution. And you'd imagine that that's going to differ pretty substantially for different products. You might be a daily active user on YouTube, and that's a daily use case because people watch, a lot of YouTube videos, right? Or Netflix or something like that. But you're probably not necessarily a daily active on the weekends on Slack. And so if you were a PM at Slack thinking about measurement, you'd probably want to look at like a weekly cadence or a weekday daily active metric. So these are useful metrics for thinking about kind of overall number of users who are actively using the platform. But as we talked about before, you sort of need to think through this growth accounting piece because that allows you to tease out these different parts of it. You can manipulate a daily active, weekly active, monthly active metric by spending on ads, sending email notifications, sending push notifications, reducing steps in the flow, like friction in a flow. If it was lead qual, you could bring in a lot more leads in the very top of your funnel by maybe asking them fewer questions, but downstream you might see you're actually closing fewer deals because you didn't collect the right information to be able to qualify them better. So we talked about frequency, good, useful, but has its problems. Let's talk about intensity. So we can think about within a given time period, how intensely users use our products. So out of a week, do 10% of my users come 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, and so on. And you can generate basically a distribution of your users and how many times they come to use your service or app or whatever in this time frame. And that's useful to kind of understand how you fit in someone's life, right? So if you're thinking about your, 50th percentile user coming to your service, let's say once a week, and you are announcing a lot of new features and you have like 5 new feature announcements, and they come after a week and they see these 5 announcements sort of piled up, that's actually probably going to be a pretty bad experience for them. But if the 50th percentile customer of yours or user of yours comes every day, then actually one of those happening today is probably fine. We can also think about stickiness as people getting to these experiences that are great. So people getting to what I like to call the magic moment or aha moment. And this is going to differ based on what your app or site does. So if you think about a user journey, someone coming in and trying to get something done, right? Maybe it's they come to YouTube, they put in a search query for how to make a table. They look at and browse through a couple videos. They click on one and they watch it, and voila, they know how to make a table. Thinking through that user journey, what are the steps that somebody goes through as they get to that magic moment will allow you to think through each piece of that, instrument metrics to understand the drop-off at each step of that journey, and then figure out where you want to focus your time, where you want to fix the biggest parts of drop-off as someone is getting to that moment of value, to that magic moment. So let's look at Airbnb. What's the magic moment for Airbnb? Well, it's not creating an account on Airbnb, nor is it viewing a bunch of places. It's you put in a location you want, you put in your check-in, check-out dates, maybe your number of guests or pets or other search criteria. You browse a number of detail pages, and then you either instant book if you like it, and the host has turned on instant book, or you message the host and ask them, if you can stay at their place for those dates, and then they say yes, and then you book. And assuming that there's not kind of a really high cancellation rate or anything like that, assuming generally the hosts have good ratings and stuff like that, which Airbnb actually does through like a superhost program. The magic moment is you have a place to stay on this ski weekend in Lake Tahoe where there's going to be amazing snow. Obviously, the rest of the product experience needs to live up to that. But success is kind of that match being made between a guest and a host so that they can book. And you would not expect most guests to be using Airbnb on a daily basis. Maybe not even on a weekly basis. If you get a 3 weeks of vacation or something a year, maybe you use it 3 times a year. Maybe you use it for some other weekend trips or something too. But thinking through kind of the right frequency based on what your app does and what people come to it for is super important. Just spouting out kind of daily active users or something is not right for actually a lot of apps. And you could think about the banking space, right? So let's take Bank of America. If you're a PM on the Bank of America app, the way you think about measuring and getting users to that magic moment is very, very different than you might think about measuring, YouTube or time spent on Facebook. A user's magic moment is probably to know their account balance, or to apply for a credit card easily, or to make a payment for a bill that they got. And so things like time spent in the app are actually probably counter metrics in some sense. You want it to be easy. You want it to be lightweight for someone to get to that magic moment. The magic moment here is different from that of Airbnb, is different from that of Facebook, is different from that of Spotify. Spotify is delivering you value if you have music there that you want to listen to and if you're listening regularly. Time is probably a good metric for something like Spotify. Time is probably not a good metric for something like an online banking app. Because if you think through the user journey, the magic moment here is that payment that you send to someone you need to pay a bill for. So thinking through the user journey gets you to figure out what the magic moment is, which is typically your kind of North Star metric, the thing you want to measure. And if you're doing well with retaining your users, is typically the thing that goes up over time. So stickiness is not necessarily time spent or daily active users. For a work productivity tool, if, let's say, autocomplete on Gmail worked amazingly well, you literally could just hit tab and it perfectly replied to every email that you got. Well, you actually wouldn't need to spend much time in Gmail. So time spent would be a bad metric. Maybe emails replied to, as an example, could be a good metric. Or edit distance, if you have to go edit a lot of what it sort of pre-writes for you, that's an indication that maybe it doesn't work super well. So think through the user journey as a way to figure out what the right magic moments are for your users. At One Signal, which is a platform for apps and websites to message their users, a magic moment is someone sending a notification and for the very first time, getting it on their phone. Right? It means they've successfully configured it, they dropped in the right information, they put the SDK onto their website or onto their app, and they now have seen the service work. And so we actually spend a lot of time thinking through what are the steps that a user goes through to get to that magic moment, and how do we reduce the friction for them to get there? So we talked about frequency, daily active, weekly active, monthly active. We talked about tracking all the steps as someone gets to that magic moment to measure kind of intensity and value. One final thing we should think about in measuring retention is retention curves. And so the way these work is you can think about your users who sign up in, let's say, January. How many of them 1 month in, 2 months in, 3 months in, 4 months in are still using your service, have come back in month 1, month 2, and so on? By definition, in the month they start using it, 100% of the people have used it in that month who signed up in that month. So it starts at 100% and over time drops off. Now, these are useful because they let you compare how well your users are retaining based on when they signed up. So what you see in this graph here is actually the users who signed up in March are retaining at a higher rate. So 1 month in, or 2 months in, or 3 months in, or 4 months in. That line is strictly higher than the line for February and the line for January. And so that tells me that we're doing a better job retaining people who signed up in March. Maybe we made improvements to our onboarding flow, or maybe we did a better job educating them about how to use the product. And so when you see that, that's actually really good. That's an indication that you're doing a better job retaining new people than you used to. It's also a good way to look at, hey, have I broken something, or have I done something that is causing me to retain my users less well? Maybe a competitor came into the space, maybe you added new features, you added complexity to the product that is confusing to new users. And so maybe you need to kind of disclose that over time or update your onboarding to help them understand this now broader set of features. So retention curves are a great way when you're thinking about growth of your product to figure out how you're doing with onboarding users relative to how you used to be doing. So we talked about what stickiness is. We talked about a number of different metrics to measure it. Now let's talk about some kind of interesting learnings of what works and doesn't, and some numbers around that. So these experiences are informed by my work at OneSignal as VP of Product. Were used by more than 1 million developers to send 8 billion with a B notifications every day. My work at LinkedIn, where I worked on newsfeed, added new post types, added translations to newsfeed, and worked on some of the content understanding and feed ranking and relevance pieces. And then also by my work at Facebook, where I shipped their first work in speech recognition, worked on newsfeed, and built their mobile ads format called Instant Experiences. It's still an ad format today. So the first learning is to show people relevant content. This sounds super basic, but you would be surprised at how infrequently it is done well. So at OneSignal, there's a analysis we did where we looked at apps that send push notifications to their whole user base versus apps that segment their user base. And we looked at the click-through rates of those notifications. And you could do things like control for like the number of folks you're reaching and sample size and stuff, which can kind of control for how far along or how sophisticated an app is or where it is in its life cycle. And basically, what we found was if you use segments, if you segment your users based on their actions, based on when they last opened the app, based on what country they're in, based on whatever you want to segment them on. We actually didn't look in detail at what the different segmentation levers people used are. There's a lot of options they have. But just basic segmentation of showing folks more relevant stuff versus everybody seeing the same stuff gave a 50% increase in relative click-through rate. So that is to say, if your click-through rate on notifications was 5% and you weren't segmenting, even a two-way segmentation or three-way segmentation, something pretty basic, was showing up as a 50% relative increase in click-through rate. The other data point here was actually from my work at LinkedIn. So there were a lot of teams working a lot of different projects. And one of the most impactful at driving up weekly active users of all the projects we were working on at LinkedIn across, hundreds of people, one of the most impactful across the whole year of all these projects was coming up with a reason for each user each day to come to LinkedIn. And so you could think of that as creating the notification inventory. We didn't always send those notifications to end users, but we started thinking about it as, how can we create a reason for them? That could be a piece of content that we think they're going to be interested in. That could be an update from their friend. That could be them tagged in a post. Obviously, if we have something where someone tags you or adds you as a connection, that's probably higher value than a kind of generic news update. But if we have a piece of news that's really relevant based on what you've read and what you've browsed and your interests, then that's a great way to pull you back to LinkedIn. And so that was one of the bigger drivers of engagement of all the projects in a given year. Just thinking about showing folks content that is relevant for them. Another thing we can think about as a kind of macro learning, and I'll go through a couple examples related to this one, is removing friction. So I was working at Facebook, and there's a lot of small advertisers. And as video was growing as a more prominent format, we realized that it was important to actually have video ads inventory. And so you think about things like Facebook Watch and Facebook Live. It'd be really weird if you put in a static ad, just a picture that doesn't move, in the middle of video content. And so it was important to get small advertisers to start creating video ads. Now, the challenge is creating video ads is actually a bit of work. And you had to either go to iMovie or get Adobe Premiere or Final Cut Pro or something if you wanted to do it really well. But a lot of these small businesses had pages on Facebook and were already posting images to their pages. So what we did is we removed the friction from them creating video ads by auto-creating a video ad for them based on the images. You see an example kind of here in the upper right. We also built out tools where they could customize these things. But the basic insight was they are posting photos to their page. We can stitch those together, show it to them in their newsfeed, and say, hey, do you want to show this ad to 5,000 people for $20? Yes. Super simple. They created a video ad without having to have video editing software, without having to go through an ads interface. We made it super, super simple by removing the friction and using the fact that they already were posting content to Facebook that we could reuse. Another example of how impactful removing friction can be was at LinkedIn. Sorry, it was at OneSignal, where recently we shipped a product for in-app messaging. So basically lets you show users content in your app. And you could design it and add photos and text and buttons and all sorts of stuff, carousels of content. But one of the things we heard when we were talking to our users was that they weren't sure how to get started, or they didn't have a designer to make it look really good. And so, as one might expect, a lot of the initial designs that customers would come up with were not great. And what we did was we looked at kind of the types of things they were trying to get done, and we pre-created templates for them. So now if you go to OneSignal today and you go to in-app messages, you'll see that there are these pre-created in-app messages. And we figured out what these should be basically by looking at what in-app messages people were creating and doing some user research to understand what folks wanted. You see a couple examples here, launching a new product or kind of a walkthrough on the left, asking for App Store ratings in the middle, doing a promotion or upsell kind of on the right. And the impact of this, the impact of just creating a handful of templates that serve these common use cases is, of all the in-app messages that are on OneSignal today, a double-digit percentage are from this small handful of templates. We just took a thing people needed to do and made it simpler, removing friction from the process. They didn't have to guess at, finding an image for animated stars. We just put something there. They can modify it. They can change it if they want. But we really thought about how we could make it easy for folks to start getting value without having to jump through too many hoops. Another example. There's a theme here. Removing friction is great. We were looking at the data when I was at LinkedIn, and we found that there are millions and millions and millions of posts viewed by people who don't speak the language of the post. And you can think about this as, you go to CES or something like that, and you work at a tech company, and someone from Samsung goes to CES as well. And, you guys both speak English, but they, let's say, speak Korean most of the time when they're not kind of working with a counterpart abroad or what have you. And so they post in Korean on LinkedIn, and your friends, your connections with them. You see this post in your LinkedIn newsfeed, and you don't understand it. And so you're not likely to like or comment or share that post. In fact, you might not even understand it, and you're probably not going to go through the effort to copy and paste it into Google, right? So think about the steps of I select, I open a new tab, I paste it in, I say Korean to English, I hit translate, I go back to the other tab, right? That's a good amount of friction for someone just to understand what a connection of theirs said. But LinkedIn knows what languages you speak if you put them on your profile. And a lot of people do, because if you've gone through the effort to learn a language, you probably want folks to know that you have that skill on a professional network. We also know the language that you're accessing LinkedIn in, because that's reported by the operating system. So we know basically what languages you speak. We know the language of the post, and we can automatically translate it if it's in a language different from what you speak. So we did that, we shipped that, and by virtue of doing that, we were able to get way more engagement on these posts that are in a language you don't speak. So for instance, imagine your friend from Samsung says, hey, they're hiring for a designer that can be based either in Seoul or the Bay Area, and you live in the Bay Area. That's a great opportunity for you. That's a conversation that you can start if you understand what they're saying, but that would have never happened if there was a lot of friction in the process. And this is used a ton. This is actually a pretty commonly used feature at LinkedIn now. Finally, in terms of database learnings, helping your users understand the value you're providing them, right? So if you have a Nest thermostat, it will tell you saved X amount of energy. You got a green leaf by turning down the heat, or by being out of the house, or what have you, because of your Nest thermostat. At OneSignal, one of the things we've done is think through not just saying, hey, here's a number of notifications you sent, but actually here's the number of sessions, or here's the number of downstream, if you instrument it. Here's the number of downstream actions, we call them outcomes, that sending this notification generated. How do you close the loop on the value you're creating? And so at Facebook, I was working on speech recognition, and we ran this test and noticed that videos with captions got 12% more watch time for the same video if you A/B test. Same video, half the people see the captions for it, half the people don't. For a big number of videos. The adding captions got you 12% more watch time than not having captions. And this makes sense actually if you think about it, because by default, sound is off on the Facebook newsfeed. You can turn it on, but by default, it's off. And so advertisers, pages, news organizations who had taken content for TV or YouTube or formats where you're expecting sound to be on and put it on Facebook would see that sometimes folks would just scroll by it because they didn't have the context of the audio. So we auto-generated captions when advertisers or pages were uploading videos, showed those captions to them and said, oh, by the way, if you add these captions, you'll get 12% more watch time. We auto-generated them. That took a lot of the friction out, but we still were asking them to sort of proofread because none of speech recognition is perfect, right? So we asked them to look over them, and then they get this big benefit of more people, more time spent watching their videos. We also then got a lot of great training data to improve our speech recognition system. And so we were able to get that data and get them more watch time by being really clear about what the value was and by putting kind of the proof points out there so people understood that value. So we've talked about what stickiness is, how we measure it, and a couple kind of ways that we can look at experiences of driving stickiness, having real world metrics impacts. Let's talk a little bit about things we could do to create stickiness. So first off, you need to build a good core experience. If you're not solving a problem that people have, if you're not doing something useful on a consistent basis, then all the re-engagement strategies in the world will not make up for that. You can bring people back once, you can send them notifications, you can send them emails. If they don't have a good experience, they're not going to keep coming back. And to get to that good experience, really think about, how do I get users to that magic moment? What is that magic moment? What problem am I solving for them? So assuming you've done that, you want to think about how you can identify relevant triggers to bring people back. So as an example, abandoned cart reminders are really good. And you see this actually in kind of the downstream metrics for them, because they match this intent, you intended to buy a product, with a potential action, which is like, yeah, I forgot about it, I want to check out. Oh, and by the way, maybe now you're offering me a little bit of a discount or something. So those triggers can take a bunch of different forms depending on your app. But let's say I'm a gaming app. And here's an example from OneSignal in the dashboard where I want to bring users back. Not just saying, hey, you haven't come to my app in a week, but instead saying, okay, you haven't come back to my app in a week. Your last session was at least a week ago. And there's a pending game. So someone has invited you to a game, but you haven't started playing that game with them, right? So there's this social reciprocity. Someone wants to play with you and you haven't yet responded to them. This is a great trigger because you probably don't want to leave your friends hanging. It's a reminder that you've left them hanging for a little bit. And it's personalized to you and the games that you have pending to play with your friends. Second learning here is to really think about matching the channel to the urgency. So if you send your users a ton of emails a day with all these kind of transactional updates, that's actually pretty noisy. And instead, if it's something kind of quick and kind of ephemeral in nature, push is a great channel for that. Likewise, if it's something where you need a record of it, an order was placed, an order is on its way, push is a less good channel for that because there's not necessarily a canonical inbox, right? Once you see it and swipe it away, it's gone. But email has an inbox, and SMS kind of has persistence to that thread. So order updates, things you want people to be able to re-access in the future, you probably want to do by email or SMS or an in-app message center. Whereas kind of quick updates, push is a great channel. And when you're thinking about push, a great thing to do here is to think about actions that people can take. So next learning is use notifications, use email, use SMS to make your product accessible anywhere. As an example, if I was Airbnb and saying, hey, someone requested to book these dates, click here to learn more about them if I'm the host. Accept, deny can be 2 action buttons, right? Maybe the dates I put in there are no longer available or something, so I need to deny. Or allow people to do inline replies if you're a messaging app. So there's a notification that comes down, allow folks to reply back inline or give them kind of smart suggestions. These are all ways they're using your product and may not necessarily be measured by time spent in your app, right? That's why we were talking about magic moments and really thinking through the user journey. But these are all ways you're delivering value to people outside of your app. Another cool example here is Google has this technology, Accelerated Mobile Pages, or AMP, and they also have some interactive technologies associated with that allow you to type into an email, let's say for your Google Docs, and make a selection. This is an example here, this little screenshot of selecting a date for a calendar that you can do within an email. So how can you make it easier for your users to get done what they're trying to get done? Invite a friend, reply to a question outside of your product to make the product accessible anywhere. And think about push, email, SMS, not just as ways to let someone know something happened, but as ways to help them get stuff done, right? Maybe I can reply back to that SMS thread. Maybe I can take an action within that email. Maybe I'm using the action buttons or the inline replies in a notification. So we're going to switch to questions in just a sec. But if I can leave you with one thing, it is to simplify the journey. Think about that user journey. Think about where you could make something easier, where you could have a smart default, where you could educate someone about that part of that product later. Measure all those things, and then start optimizing them. And as you figure out that core part of your product experience, then go look at how you bring people back with things like push notifications, email, SMS, web push, and so on. So with that, I'm going to jump over to any questions that folks have in the remaining 7 minutes. And if there's no questions, we can just end on this. Okay, yeah, so Craig is asking, any thoughts on engaging users who may not have good service or a good internet connection or something like that? Yeah, so a couple thoughts there. YouTube has actually done this kind of well. So if you look at folks with intermittent connectivity, giving options for downloading content offline. So YouTube actually offers this. I think initially they offered it in India. Maybe they've since expanded it to other geographies. But the idea was you have internet connections when you're maybe at a library or at school or something, but you might not when you're at home or when you're on the go. And so thinking about how people can download that offline, thinking about giving state, right? So not that this message is sent because you don't have an internet connection, but it will send when you do have an internet connection. And then you can actually do stuff like, great, you have an internet connection again, I let you know that it's sent. Maybe I trigger a notification or something in the app that shows you that.